Hello, history nerds, and welcome to another episode of the History and Games podcast. On this special episode of the show, we are joined by game dev, consultant, and podcaster Rami Ismail to talk about 6 Days in Fallujah. Some context for those who aren't aware, 6 Days in Fallujah is a game set during the Second Battle of Fallujah, 2004, during the Iraq War. A conflict where a US-led coalition of nations invaded Iraq under the guise of removing supposed WMDs from the Iraqi government, but was a thinly veiled plan to assert Western dominance over the Middle East by getting rid of the most powerful force in the region. It's an incredibly messy and terrible conflict that led to the deaths of thousands of people and elevated levels of Islamophobia that became rampant following the US's actions in the region. The game was originally in development during 2009, but public backlash forced Konami to shutter the project, and it has since been picked up by Highwire Games. Rami, I wanted to ask you first about the approach that they seem to be taking with this, because as someone who doesn't personally know a lot about game development and the process involved, I wanted to ask you about their documentary style approach, because that's, as someone who, I used to do film work, I have worked in documentary, short films, and TV, and the documentary approach is an interesting one for me from a game development perspective.
I mean, in essence, no, and it's not new for us to be using documentary as a style or as a format. There's been some really interesting autobiographical work that sort of touched on that, including games like The Dragon Cancer, about a family losing a young child to a terminal cancer. Which was a true story based in a real life and was sort of used as a way of processing the grief, but also celebrating the life of Joel, the child. Games are not in any way antithetical or impossible to make in a documentary shape, right? Games have for a very long time used a tremendous amount of research, tremendous amount of interviewing, tremendous amount of conversation to capture certain experiences and to make them accessible to players in video game format, whether that is as simple as, simple is a big word, but whether that is as straightforward as soccer in a FIFA game, all the way to complex historical battles in strategy games or action games. There's nothing new about making a documentary style game. Like we've done that before. We've seen that before. This is a little bit more explicit in it, from what I understand. But in that regard, there's not much here that is shocking, right? It's a game mixed with a documentary.
Right. So it's not so much the documentary style approach that's what I would say kind of wrong with how they're taking the game. It's more so about how they're using that information, or I should say not using information. Peter Tamti, when interviewed specifically, said that they're not interested in portraying some of the atrocities or war crimes that happened. And I feel like if you're taking a documentary style approach, you should be more kind of like fluid in how you choose to show things. I feel like if you get information that changes your hypothesis, having worked on a few documentaries, there are some aha moments you tend to get where someone will say something in an interview and it'll force you to have to change your entire perspective because it turns out you were going about it wrong. And I feel like that's what the game should be about. It just feels like the game should be about what went wrong for everyone involved, and I feel like that sort of experience isn't really being respected. And I think, looking at it, I think that might be more of the issue than the documentary style approach.
Right, like as you said, the problem is we don't really get to say what 6 Days in Fallujah wants to be, right? The game is being created by a group of clearly talented individuals. Game looks good, and it seems to be smooth. They have a very clear vision of what they're making. It's not that they're accidentally making a game that is approaching this conflict from a very, very almost propagandist approach. It's that they're intentionally doing that, right? I'm not my objection to the game isn't that they're accidentally making a game that erases the experience and the horrors that the Iraqi citizens went through during the siege of Fallujah. People that were, stuck in a city were not allowed to escape because they were men of military age, and the U.S. Army just returned people that tried to flee the city back because they couldn't be sure whether they were insurgents or not. And then, went door to door, killing anything that looked like a threat. That is what happened in Fallujah. If they choose not to make that game, that is 100% a choice that they can make, right? Clearly, the opposite would probably not be true. But they've chosen to make this game in support of the stories and with the goal of engendering empathy for the U.S. soldiers that went there. And, if you want to tell a story about heroes, you can't tell the story of the horrors they inflict, because then they stop being heroes. So it's not really my problem that they accidentally made a game that dehumanizes and erases the hurt of lots of people. It's that they're intentionally doing it that is my problem.
Right. And I feel like that's an issue in regards to American media overall, because I feel like American media, whether it be video games, films, or television, I feel like it pushes this narrative where people feel okay purposefully misrepresenting the lives of the Iraqi citizens who were destroyed simply because it doesn't necessarily mesh with the established narrative of the United States Armed Forces being heroic. We need to look beyond the American exceptionalism that exists in media and instead be more critical with an eye. Or look at it with a more critical eye.
I think the thing is, this is not something new, right? There's this incredible quote that is American foreign policy is horrendous because not only will America come to your country and kill all your people, but what's worse, I think, is that they'll come back 20 years later and make a movie about how killing your people made their soldiers feel sad.
Right.
Right. This is not a new thing, and it's a thing that as an Arab, I grew up with as a kid, because this was not the first war in the Middle East that happened, and it won't be the last war that happens, and it's very rarely a war that is actually fought between the U.S. and a local nation. It's usually a proxy war fought between the U.S. and whatever interests they have at that point. It's just cheaper to do it in Middle Eastern countries because they don't actually care about the people that live there, and they barely can count them as collateral, right? Any statistics about deaths in Iraq or Afghanistan are disputed, are uncertain. We know to the number how many U.S. soldiers have died in those countries, but we can't tell how many civilians died because the U.S. military refused to track that in any meaningful way. The best we have is we can check how many people have presumably died and check how different that is from how many people would normally die in a year. And if you do that, we have over 1 million people dead because of a lie about weapons of mass destruction, right? If we just track the amount of bodies found, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people across the wars in the Middle East. If we take the official numbers, as far as I'm aware, barely any civilians have died because they don't get counted as civilians, they get counted as collateral. And it's hard to tell whether collateral is insurgent or civilian, whether it's innocent or guilty. It's just somebody who died when we tried to kill somebody else, right?
Jesus fucking Christ. That's
where we are. And that's how it's been, and that's not something new. This is something that when you grow up as an Arab kid, as a Muslim kid, and you start to realize just how messed up things are, you want to say something, and you wonder why your parents don't say something, and why your family doesn't say something. It's because it's risky. You lose your opportunities because really quickly you turn into, well, I guess you must be supporting the terrorists then, right? And especially after 9/11, that sort of oppressive sense of just don't talk about it was enormous, and it's not gone. A few years ago, there was a Palestinian developer, Rashid Abu Aida, who made a game about surviving the Gaza war, and it was somewhat autobiographical, somewhat biographical. It did not refer at any point to Palestine. It did not refer at any point to Israel. It was just a game that took some of the key moments from that war, or some of the bigger moments from that war, including the death of 4 children playing soccer on the beach, being destroyed by an Israeli missile, right? And there's a moment in the game that references that. And even though there's no reference as to who fired the missile and where this is, the game still got banned from Apple platforms, from iOS, from being sold. Because it was a political game, and as an Arab, you have to just laugh at it, because I've played dozens of AAA games where there's AC-130 missions where I'm bombing an entire city to the ground, and that's somehow not political. But a game about a father and a daughter trying to escape a war zone that isn't defined, has no antagonists, no defined antagonist, no defined protagonist, besides you're a father and a daughter trying to escape a war zone, that is political. Then we know it's not fair. We know we don't get to speak. We know we don't get to talk about these things. And we know that if we try, and especially if you're in the games industry, a lot of prominent people that are Arab, that are Muslim, that have that background, are not going to speak about this, because we read a news article about a student from somewhere in the Middle East trying to enter the United States on a visa, on an education visa, on a university visa, and getting sent back home because a friend of his had sent him an image of WhatsApp, on WhatsApp, about some revolutionary thing, and that image gets automatically downloaded to your phone even if you didn't send it. They found that image and sent him back. We know we don't get to speak about this, and it's not new. Like my dad knew that, my family knew that. Everybody knows that. Our stories are not relevant. We are the props to the heroism of the United States. We are the props to the story of antagonism towards the United States. We're the terrorists that you need to have bad guys, to have good guys, right?
Right, and you see that a lot in a lot of media, from even something as simple as like Back to the Future, where the bad guys, who are the ones who started and kicked off the movie, were just they were the Libyans who were like shooting guns in the air as they chased Doc Mitchell around, and it's just something that you see too often in media that's become too normalized. I think it's how prevalent it is that you just see it everywhere, and how it's just something that's become accepted as normal. And it's absolutely disgusting how someone even daring to speak up about that is silenced because it's political. I absolutely despise the veil that you can throw over something and say, oh, it's political, we don't have to care about that, when no, it's something that people's lives aren't inherently political, and whether or not they get to live their lives in fear is something that we need to address and be cognizant of. And I think that, like the game you mentioned before about getting pulled from the App Store, I remember reading the story about that and just kind of being surprised at how, for full context, I'm a white, like half Jewish guy from New Jersey, and it still absolutely baffles me how something like that can get removed from the App Store simply for being political. But then you have everything else.
You want to know how we? Because I was part of the group that tried to get the game reinstated on the App Store. You know how we convinced them?
How?
We showed them a game that was on the App Store in which you play an Israeli missile trying to hit a little house, and it had the Israeli flag on it, and that was accepted.
Oh my God!
Instead of deleting that game, they allowed the Palestinian game, and then they still tried to put the Palestinian game. They tried to not release it as a game, but as a news app.
What? Really?
Yeah, they said it's not a game. Yeah, that was the conclusion of it. Ultimately, it released as a game, but yeah, the politics of being Arab are not straightforward. And I mean, this is not. That is also not new, right? If you take 6 Days in Fallujah, right, the game we were talking about at the start. A game like that, if you wanted to make it a documentary, right, a true documentary, you wouldn't just be representing the U.S. soldiers. You wouldn't just be representing their perspective. You would need to include at least the civilians' perspective, right, the people that are being harmed. But if you truly wanted to make a documentary, you would also have to include the opposite forces, right? You would have to include the story of why are people fighting in this city?
Absolutely.
Why Fallujah? Why that city? Why this city? I mean, a city with a proud history of resisting invaders. How did that end up being such a critical location in this war? What led to that? What led to the conflict in the first place? What led to those insurgents that the second siege was about? What led to them being there? And then you trace it back, and the reason they were there was the first siege of Fallujah, which was also a U.S. Created conflict. So the fact that we're really only seeing one perspective, like if this game, the marketing has this incredible moment near the end that is incredibly evocative. Two soldiers walk towards the door, and one of them places a hand on the doorknob, not knowing whether after they open the door whether they'll still be alive, right?
Right.
And it's an incredibly evocative moment, and it's an incredibly powerful moment. And I'm guessing a lot of people a lot of U.S. folks that fought in Fallujah and that did that will remember that as one of the most terrifying things in their life, right? Like a truly traumatic gamble with your life, with your hand on a doorknob and a friend behind you, not sure if your friend is going to be the only one left standing in a few seconds. The thing is, if you truly want to capture that moment, you also need to capture the other side of that door. Like, who is there? Is it a father with a daughter that tried to escape the city and got turned around by the soldiers? Is it two children because their parents have died in the siege already and they're hiding and they're scared and they're going to jump up and get shot down in seconds from now, not knowing what kind of monster is going to go through that door? Because to the people there, they were just living their life. They were getting invaded. A lot of people that fought in those sieges weren't fighting because they were on the side of the insurgents. They were resistance. They were fighting a foreign invasion of their lands. What is on the other side of that door? When the thing is, the story of the soldiers, I've played that. Come on, I've played that a million times. I've played that in every war from the First World War, Second World War, the Vietnam War, modern warfare, made-up wars. I've played the U.S. soldier. I've seen the perspective. I've seen the valor. I've seen the heroism. I know that in the U.S. Army and the U.S. military, the fact that I can distinguish those two is horrifying to me, that I know more about the structure of the U.S. Army than I know about the Dutch Army. The Dutch military and the U.S. military.
Right.
That's horrible. Why do I know that? Because I played video games. So I know those stories. I've seen it in movies. I've read it in books. I've listened to it in songs. I've played it in games. If they truly wanted to make something different, then why does this game sound exactly like all the other games I've played?
Exactly. Yeah.
I would have loved to play a 6 Days in Fallujah that truly captured all of that. But instead, based on the interviews, it sounds like we're going to get 90% U.S. soldiers and 10% Iraqi survivor. But the thing about that is, you said you're a filmmaker. What story you tell is ultimately up to you as the creator, right? It's what stories you choose to tell, what stories you choose to lift up as important, what stories you choose to make critical to your narrative. And the story of a father and a daughter trying to escape the city, very likely that story would have ended, in reality, it would have ended in the father being sent back home because it's a man of military age and told to stay away from the windows as the U.S. continues to, bomb the city with white phosphorus and going door to door to eliminate threats.
Exactly.
You only have to look at the state of police violence in the U.S. to know that the military is probably not going to be all that much better when it comes to making a split-second decision between whether somebody is a threat or not in a war zone where there might actually be people trying to kill the police officers all the time, right? Like at peace, what we've seen about the ability to not shoot people is relatively abysmal, I would say. So imagine what that looks like in a war zone, and it suddenly stops being surprising that there is literally a mercenary unit in Iraq that is best known for killing 17 innocent people for no reason besides that they were walking on a street, including a number of children. There's a story of a father who had to pick up the brains of his son from the ground because kid was shot in the head. Those are the stories that come out of the city. And if you're going to tell the story of Fallujah without those stories, then you're not telling the story of Fallujah. You're just making propaganda.
Exactly. It feels like if someone were to make a game about, let's say, like the sacking of Carthage, the only documents that exist from that are Roman. So naturally, you're probably going to be making a game from the Roman perspective, and you're going to be looking at the entire siege with like the Roman documents backing it up, given that, they like salted the earth and didn't leave anything alive back then. But in regards to Fallujah, these are people who are still alive today. These are people who we can go to and see how their lives not only have been impacted, but what happened before then. So we have plenty of information, but it feels like that is just being put to the wayside in order to represent an oorah kind of story where soldiers are being put on the front lines and having to go door to door. But as you said, who's behind that door? That's the story that I really want to hear more. And because of the America's place in the global entertainment industry, I think that we've seen so many America-focused stories. In some ways, that's that's a nicety. If you're American, that's, nice to see yourself represented so much. But growing up, or you kind of take for granted just our place in the global entertainment industry. America has such a wide amount of exports of TV shows, of movies, of video games. There are so many of those that are made in America.
So if I tell you, imagine this, right? Imagine a road, two-way, asphalt, white lines in the middle. And it's in the desert, right? And there's nothing as far as the eye can see. And to the left is a dusty road and to the right is a dusty road, right? And both of them go to the horizon. They go forever. And on the corner, when you turn right onto one of the dusty roads, is a mailbox, right?
Right.
What does the mailbox look like?
I'm going to say like a blue mailbox, even though it's probably wrong, but just like a blue, like kind of like box, I guess.
Right. Does it have anything else? Like, what does the mailbox look like?
It'll have a little like post or an area for you to put like letters or small packages, a locked container so that the mailman can come grab that. That's just the kind of mailboxes that I grew up with.
Right. And it's a little old, so a little rusty maybe?
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Does it have one of the little flags?
Little flags.
The flag that goes up or down?
Mine, I'm not picturing that, but I'm picturing like a New York City, like a one that's kind of like small that you can go and just drop one off at the corner.
Right. Yeah, this is probably for one house only, but sure. That mailbox that you just described, the sort of New York mailbox, the middle of the U.S. mailbox, those are the only answers I ever get, right?
Right.
Even though I've seen that exact situation in dozens of countries around the world, it's just nobody ever imagines another mailbox. And it's not just the Americans that don't imagine another mailbox. Nobody imagines another mailbox. I've never imagined a Dutch mailbox because I can tell you every skyline in the U.S. because I've seen it in a million movies, right? I've seen it in Spider-Man. I've seen it in the anything, any book, any series, anything. Like I know what the U.S. looks like. I know how the U.S. works. I know what an interstate is. And I know what an interstate looks like, but I also know, a snelweg in the Netherlands or autostraat in Egypt. But would anybody else know those? Would anybody else know what they mean and what they indicate? Because the interstates in the U.S. have this air of like travel, road trips, freedom, That's sort of like the connotations with them, right? But would you be able to tell me the connotations for a highway in any other country?
Probably not, unless I were to put American values on it, like what you said for traveling.
Right.
But other than that, like, not really, no.
And same thing, if I were to make a game about selling coffee, right? There's an actual wonderful game, Coffee Talk, made by an Indonesian company, really worth checking out. They set it in Seattle. Because it's way easier to do. If you're going to make a game set in Jakarta, you have to start by explaining Jakarta.
Right.
And the currency, how much is a coffee, right? If I wanted to tell you that the world is apocalyptic, then I show you New York, and it's empty, right? It's devoid of people. Well, I could also show Mecca being empty, which to me would mean the same thing, but somehow that's not the first thing I think of, right? The overweight that American perspective has in global media is really remarkable, and it becomes more remarkable when you see an alternative, right? So we've had war games from the U.S. for decades, right?
Right.
A few years ago, there was a Polish studio called 11-Bit that released in 2014, I think. They released This War of Mine, which is a game based on the atrocities in the I think 92 to 96, like the Siege of Sarajevo.
Yes.
Right.
Absolutely fantastic game, by the way.
Phenomenal game. Had we ever played a game that wasn't about winning a war before then? I'd played games about losing wars, maybe, but I'd never played a game about surviving a war.
It feels
How
like
is that possible?
it feels like that genre just kind of isn't, if we're gonna call it a genre, I would at least, just isn't as like I feel like I haven't seen it as often as the winning a war one. Yeah, you're absolutely correct.
So here's the thing: those mechanics, right? They are created from culture as well. There's this wonderful game in Iran called made by an Iranian developer, Mahdi Brahami. He made a game called Farsh, and it was a new mechanic. I'd never seen this mechanic before. Right? It's a game about rolling out carpets, rolling out and rolling back up carpets, and just genuinely a new puzzle mechanic. And this is incredible because, you know, you see mechanics that are mixes of other mechanics, and that, you know, progresses the medium. But it's so rare that you just see like a new base level mechanic, right? And I asked him, how did that happen? He said, I just wanted to make a game about rolling carpets. And suddenly you realize just how cultural the expressions are that we have in games. Why did we end up with shooting as such a main part of games? Part of it is technological, absolutely. But with that same technology, we could have also made a lot of other things, right? We ended up with shooter. And then shooter became one of the most popular genres. And then in shooter, we ended up telling war stories. Which way that exactly happened is hard to tell, right? Because a lot of that is subconscious. People make games as a reflection of themselves. But the fact that a Polish studio made a game about surviving war is no coincidence. It's a country that war happens to. They don't go out and fight and win wars. There's no heroism in the notion of war. There's survival. There's hurt. There's fear. So when the Polish made a game about war, they made a game about surviving war. Of course they did. That's how war exists in their mind. But just that was the first one. In decades of games industry, it took a Polish studio to make a game about surviving war. Isn't that remarkable? Doesn't that make you worry about all the games we're missing out on? And all the stories, all the mechanics, all the approaches, perspectives that we're not seeing? Because here comes 6 Days in Fallujah, another game about being a U.S. soldier fighting a war, and then we make the game about how sad the soldiers are. Here we are again. It wasn't even a new conversation in 2009 when it got canceled the first time. It was not a new conversation before that. I have lived my life seeing my people blown up, and I've never yet to see a proper adhan, a call to prayer, right? Something that happens 5 times a day in every Muslim country around the world. The call to prayer from a mosque, I've never seen it. I've seen 3/4 of it in Kingdom of Heaven, but they cut it short, which is absolutely not allowed. But They don't really care anyway.
It's just something that like I never like had the perspective of. Like when I was growing up, I kind of like I had the idea like, oh yeah, there are foreign movies, there are foreign games, there, like if I were to think of like Germany, for example, like when I was a child, I used to think like, oh yeah, of course Germany probably has like their own Hollywood or something, but they don't. Or like there is a German film industry, but it's not the same level that Hollywood has. It's not, and I reference Hollywood a lot because the film background, it's just a lot easier for me. But
Right.
like the same applies to the games industry. There's a gigantic focus of it in the United States, and that doesn't tend to lend itself well when considering the perspectives of other people. Like, for example, the Polish game that you mentioned, where in this War of Mine, where the Polish perspective is incredibly important in that because of Poland's history with wars and conflicts. Just as I feel Spec Ops: The Line, it's a game that had to have been made by a company that's not in the United States because not only is it a game that is going against the status quo of a United States military shooter, but the German perspective on that is incredibly important. It's not a game that would have benefited from an American guy leading the project. It's something that had to have been done outside of the country. And I feel like you're absolutely right. There's an entire world out there that doesn't have the means to put out their game in the way that they would. And because of that, you see their voices fall into the wayside as more U.S. companies tend to take prevalence over that. And I think that's just kind of like, I think that's a byproduct of the United States' place in the entertainment industry, but I also think that's a byproduct of just the United States' kind of like over presence in throughout the 20th century going into the 21st century.
Right. I mean, the honest truth, like Spec Ops, like being a German company, like again, look for the fingerprint, right? Germans making a game about how bad war can be is no coincidence either, right? Like there is definitely an acknowledgement of the atrocities of war and what it does to people. That is just sort of cultural in Germany. But then you have to wonder, how did they end up with the U.S. military and Dubai as like the places that the game takes place and the army that is invading, right?
Right.
And again, it shows you that even when people try to make games about national issues, about national issues or personal issues to them, they end up having to work that through the lens of the United States. Broforce was a South African game that was almost entirely about the U.S. like military entertainment complex.
Right.
Yeah, and it uses that South African, like almost trademark South African like level of biting sarcasm that they used to talk about so many very difficult things in their country. The sort of like the metaphor that you also see in things like District 9. It's a very cultural way of talking about difficult topics. It's just going all in on it, just through a different lens. They end up using the U.S. military. We just talked about Coffee Talk. They put it in the U.S. We talk about Spec Ops: The Line. It's the U.S. military. Even if we want to make games about our own culture, we're still going to have to be aware of that. We have to feed it through English, right? I can't make an Arabic joke in a game because nobody will get it. The only way I can do an Arabic joke is if I translate the joke into English, into a thing that is funny to English people, and then continue. I can't make a reference to an expensive coffee. If I tell you a coffee is 10 Egyptian pounds or 100 Egyptian pounds, both of those mean the same to you, right?
Right.
100 sounds like more, but you don't know if that's a lot for a coffee or is it actually cheap for a coffee? Does that mean the economy is doing well or is it not well? So now I have to explain that, right? There are so many shortcuts that you get access to as soon as you set it in the US or the UK that you lose in most other countries around the world. Like you still get sort of like the Western shortcuts if you put it in parts of West Europe, right? But you lose all your shortcuts as soon as you go outside of the US, maybe Japan and the UK. And that means that even when we try to make games around the world that aren't about the Western world, about the Anglosphere, about any of that, we still have to go through that. We still have to force our stories through that, even if just because we have to translate it. Even because we need to, we can make a joke about Friends right now, right?
Yeah.
And we'd be fine. We'd understand. We both know the theme song, right? But if I would say Schippers van de Chameleon, you'd be like, what? And if I said Captain Magic,
I'd be nodding my head and going, yeah, sure.
That sounds like a thing. So I've just lost my cultural, for both of my cultures, right? As a Dutch person, as an Egyptian person, I have to tell my stories, forcing them through the lens of what global culture, which is overwhelmingly US culture, thinks of my countries, which means that in Egypt, if I want to portray the pyramids, I have to put them in the desert, because if I would show you where the pyramids actually are, they're in the middle of a city.
Yeah,
there's no desert. The Pizza Hut is like a stone's throw away. Like literally,
like Airbnbs
if you're
that literally have it like. Oh, sorry.
Right. No, it's fine. If you stand at the Sphinx, you're closer to a Pizza Hut than to the pyramids. Like they're in the middle of the city. But you see it in Sonic, you see it in Transformers, you see it in any movie. It's in the middle of the desert. So now, if I want to portray the pyramids, do I put it in the middle of the city and make people go like, "Why is it in the middle of the city?" Or do I put it in the middle of the desert where people just go like, "Oh, right, the pyramids."
Right. There's a certain like point in time where you have to go, do I have to portray this accurately, or do I want to portray this in the way or in the context of the culture that'll be viewing it?
Right. Which very often people opt for the later because it's overwhelming and it works everywhere. The way the US looks at the world is exported worldwide, thanks to Hollywood, thanks to the games industry, thanks to books, thanks to all the big prizes from the Grammys and the Emmys and even things like the Nobel Prizes. Having a jury that can overwhelmingly read English and understand English, but not necessarily any other language. My dad always used to joke that there's only been one Arab that has won the Nobel Prize for Literature not because we don't write good books, but because the jury can't read them. Right. And he's not wrong.
He's absolutely not. No, it gets filtered through English, and even then, like you start to lose some of the things that make it beautiful in its own native language. Because English, I'm sure everyone knows, English is not a perfect language. I barely even speak it, and I've been speaking it my entire life, and it's just something that doesn't translate well when you have to literally translate things into English. You lose out on some of the things that make every language beautiful, and through that, you start to. I actually had like another bit about this in a past episode, but you start to kind of like wash away the bits of culture that make things special.
Right. Yeah, it's fascinating. And you know what the most fascinating thing is to me right now, and this is not a good thing, and I'm not necessarily celebrating anything, but one of the most fascinating things has been the sort of US response to China's growing influence on US media. Right. Through money, through funding, China has had a growing influence on what characters get represented, what movies come out, what stories get told in the U.S. And there's a genuine sense of fear about that, right? We're seeing it reflected now in lots of awful things, in increased violence against any Asian people, in sort of a xenophobic, racist expression of phobia for any Asian people, in a strong antagonism towards China. And do the Americans understand that this is in many ways the way much of the world has been feeling about Hollywood, about the overweight of U.S. culture? And I hate that more people have to feel that way, right?
Absolutely.
I hate that there's now more people that have to feel like our culture, our way of life, our understanding of what is right and wrong is now being affected by external forces. It's a terrifying feeling. It's also been the status quo and the default for me my entire life. And, rather than now all the power going to another country, I would much rather have that just somehow we find a way to make this more even, more equal, to tell stories in different ways. And, language is a complicated thing, and there's always going to have to be a lingua franca, right? A language that everybody speaks, or that most people speak, so that we can communicate across borders. But there has to be a way to make things more fair, right? To make sure that we can tell a story from Uruguay without having to filter it through how the West or the US sees it. To make a story about the war in Fallujah that isn't scared of showing the opposite side. To see more games like This War of Mine, or more new mechanics like in Farsh, or more perspectives on superpowers in the world like Broforce. There must be a way to see more of that, right? To have Coffee Talk be set in Jakarta, to not have a game studio have to, and I don't know if they feel this way, but to have to feel that they have to set their own stories in a different country, and then potentially to feel guilt about not setting it in their own country when it reaches success. Like, all of that should not be so, right? The way it should be that anybody should be able to tell a story from their country, from their culture, without fearing that the most powerful culture in the medium will ban the game, or will reject the game, or will say that the game is political, or not understand the game. That we all get to use a shortcut that is ours instead of somebody else's. And, that's something I've been fighting for 10 years now, and it's something that I don't think I'm going to solve in my lifetime. But it is definitely something that, even though the victories are small, every now and then, a victory happens, and I think it makes things better, it makes things more fair.
Right. It's definitely not something that I think we can solve in our lifetime, at least by ourselves. And I wanted to just go back a little bit to China and just the xenophobia towards Asian stories overall. I feel like that's something that's really taken roots in just kind of like American culture, where we see something that is getting bigger than us, and Americans feel threatened by it, and we feel the need to lash back at it. And I feel that's so wrong. So just kind of like it's presumptuous of the Americans to just kind of like think that, oh, we're on top, so nothing can really like come and attack us. And then like stories set in Asia are just something that haven't even been like considered, or even if they are, there's something that is kind of like uniquely like through the American perspective, like you said before, because it kind of is forced in that lens no matter what. Even if it was an Asian developer wanting to make a game set in an Asian country, and no matter what, it has to be set through the perspective of an American lens, because ultimately that's like the perspective that people who are playing it would be playing it from. And I think that it feels like people are fighting as if the U.S. is in a position to lose. And that's just not something, it's not a fight in that case. It's just accepting of other cultures being able to tell their stories. And I feel that's something that hasn't been able to happen until like recently. And I think that the more people, I say this a lot, and I'm sorry that I keep going back on it, but the more people that can tell their stories without fear of having to do it through a certain lens or being attacked just for telling their stories, I think will make for a much more diverse and better world that we can exist in. The more art that is created by people who can experience it is all the better. And history is experienced by everyone. It shouldn't matter who you are. You should be looking at history as or from the perspective of who you are, not from the perspective of anyone else who is telling you it.
Right. That is a lovely sentiment that I think most of the world can't even imagine. I sure couldn't. I still can't. I can't look at the world from my history, because there's always somebody else's history in there, right? Egypt is most of the history that was well preserved, and that is taught in Dutch schools, is the British perspective on the Egyptian colony. I don't know what that feels like. I have no idea. The Dutch are really good at rewriting history, and we've done that very extensively. Like, it's not like the Netherlands don't have a problem with racism and a history of colonialism. And you are right. Like, I think this is more of a Western problem than a U.S. specific problem, that we don't like feeling that any culture encroaches on our between air quotes like great values and enlightened society, right? My dad perfectly summarized that once when he was he was forced to. He's a teacher, and he was forced to teach one of two subjects. He used to be a language teacher, but he was forced to teach either math or history. And even though he's okay at math, he doesn't love it. And as an Egyptian, my parents always shared a love for history. So my dad, he offered to teach history, and I got the curriculum so he could read through it and like get up to speed. And I visited him the next week, and the books were just like spread over the room. Like he clearly had gotten a little annoyed and had thrown one or two of the books across the room. And I asked him, what is wrong? And he's like, is this what they teach you? I'm like, yeah, history is like, this is what they teach you. So let me get this straight. There's the prehistory, right? Then there's a bunch of empires, Babylonians, Egyptians. Egyptians are good, but like, yeah. I'm like, yeah. He's like, and then the Greeks, the Romans. I'm like, yeah. He's like, and then the Renaissance. I'm like, yeah. He's like, what happened between those two?
That's such a that's such a large period of time just to jump. Oh my God, what?
Right. Dark Ages? He's like, no, that was here. That was Europe. Europe was the Dark Ages. Europe sat in the mud and like we're playing around like drawing things. We were inventing the zero over there, like everything about history that astronomy, mathematics, like stuff like that. All of Asia, all of large parts of Asia, large parts of North Africa, of the Middle East, were in a golden age of figuring out scientific discovery after discovery, new inventions, new ways of thinking about the world. Most of what we are doing now, having a conversation over a cable that goes under the ocean through zeros and ones, like most of the basis for that was laid in that era in the Middle East, right? Ideas of math and ideas of language, of history. So my dad was angry, and we actually suggested an additional curriculum that he would teach, so he could teach it without feeling guilty. And so we created this beautiful extra addendum where my dad would touch on the sort of like what happened in the rest of the world during those hundreds of years. So we made that, and he took that to the school, and he teaches math now.
Right. That's just, wow, I'm personally incredibly bothered how they managed just to skip over the Islamic Golden Age just like that, as if it were just nothing. That's just something that, I mean, like, even like with all the faults of the American education system, even I learned that, right? Like,
Right.
like it feels like being taught like a history from somewhere else that isn't where you are. So for example, like if the American history, or like how it's kind of taught in schools, it's they tend to go like, okay, well, there's the ancient history, there's the Egyptians, the Romans, the Babylonians. Most of this kind of stuff you learn in like middle school, and then in high school they start like switching you off to like, okay, here's world history, and then here's American history, and then for like
Right.
world history, it's also very like condensed. I mean, they have to fit it inside like a year like school curriculum, so that I understand, but it feels so weird to me to just have world history and then American history, because I mean
Right.
my dad's an American history major, and even he remarks or has remarked to other American history majors just how weird it is to have American history as a major in its own right, because just of how little of it there is. America's only been around for like 350 years or
You should
300
hear my
years as
dad
a
about
country.
that. My dad always remarks that the U.S. is being such a teenager right now. Uh,
I
it always
actually
makes
love
me
that.
laugh.
Can I steal that? Because I love that.
Yeah, for sure. It always makes me laugh, but yeah, no, it's true. It's remarkable, and I mean the same is true probably for each nation, right? People teach their own history, but it is remarkable that just how much history is left out, and just how much that affects how we see the world, and which people we see as human, right, or as part of the growth of our people. While in reality, obviously, almost every culture on earth has had a major contribution to what the world is as it is now. either as it is or in the history of humanity. But the way we are taught is that, most of the important things happened in this one little area, mostly Europe. And then at some point, some Europeans went over the ocean and then did some stuff there. That's kind of how we teach history.
Yeah, it also doesn't help that the Europeans kind of wiped away any written records from other nations
Right.
when they got there. Like I forget what exactly the percentage is, but I think 95% of any form of Central American history has been lost, and there's only like a few books, or what it can even be considered
Right.
books, that are left that can even indicate what thousands upon thousands of years of Central American history even looked like before the Europeans got there.
The easiest way I've always found it to explain just how complete the erasure of the rest of America has been as a continent is the fact that the U.S. is referred to as America.
Yes, 100%.
Like that's the fastest way to explain just how much of America has been erased. Like the Captain America somehow only fights in the U.S. There's even a South American comic meme about that, where Captain America takes a phone call and it's somebody from Bolivia being like, "Hey, somebody stole my bag in Bolivia. Come down now." And then you see Captain America looking at a map of all of America. And then on the next slide, he's changed the sign of Captain America on his desk to Captain USA. And it's just like a meme that goes like everybody everywhere knows this, except for in the United States, where people don't realize that it's kind of weird that the U.S. has claimed the entire continent as its name.
Yeah.
That there is now a Central America and a South America.
It's like referring to like
America.
Britain as Europe.
Right. So it's kind of, and the funny thing is there are still ways in which it shines through, right? Like cultures don't get erased that easily. They're in our language. They're in our way of thinking, in our way of existing. I went to Malta, beautiful little island in the middle of the Mediterranean, extremely important strategic location.
It's one of my dream places to go to. I've always wanted to go to Malta. There's so much history in that tiny little island. It's absolutely incredible and breathtaking.
So the beauty of Malta is that for a long time it was contested between the North African cultures and the European cultures, and they fought over it, and lots of horrible wars took place on that island. Until at some point there was sort of an equilibrium. One or the other parties would sort of like own the island, but they would mostly leave people be, right? The civilians that live there. So you got this kind of incredible mix of language, this incredible mix of culture, this incredible mix of history, until eventually the European Christians came and just sort of destroyed anything that looked Muslim or North African.
Right. That would be the Knights Hospitaller, I believe, if my history is correct.
I think that was it. So they destroyed most anything. The one thing they couldn't destroy was the language. So when I went to Malta and I sat in a cab, I realized that I understood most of the weather report that was being broadcast on the radio. And I asked my cab driver, I'm like, "Are you Arab?" He's like, "No, I'm Maltese." I'm like, "Why are you listening to Arab radio?" He's like, "That's Maltese." I'm like, "No, I understand what the person is saying. He's saying like what's going to be this and that." And he's like, "You speak Maltese?" I'm like, "No, I speak Arabic." And despite the destruction of the culture, right? Despite the destruction of the records, despite the destruction of the buildings, and the creation of this myth that Malta was a Christian country, the language couldn't hide its history, right?
Right.
Because you don't change language easily. And for me, that has always been one of the more fascinating things about language, is that it belies so much of our history in ways you wouldn't expect. The English words for anything related to seafaring just are straight up Dutch, because the Dutch were some of the largest seafarers in history. So if you talk about a ship, that's schip in Dutch, mast, kanon. Your word haven is the Dutch haven, and of course those Dutch words have history that go further back, right? Like goes into Norse history, goes into German history or Germanic history. Some of it goes into French history. But a lot of those words went via Dutch. Sea, zee, river, rivier, boat, sail, zeil. All of those words, came via Dutch, overwhelmingly via Dutch into English, and via English into the US. There's also a bunch of French that made it in. The English is actually quite a fascinating language in that regard. But there's so much history in the words we use, and I've always sort of appreciated that language has a very hard time lying about where things come from.
Right. And I think that's kind of where video games are in an incredibly unique position because I mean, like personally, in regards to language, and I actually had a few future episode planned on this, but I wanted to talk about it very quickly because you bring up a great point in how language is something that preserves a culture. It's something that is so incredibly important and tied to a culture's identity that it's able to persevere even after that culture has kind of like fallen to the wayside or changed, or even in the case of like Maltese history before the Hospitallers, before it died. And I think that I personally try to play video games. If it's a historical game or a game set in another location, I try to play that game in a language that is more representative of where that game is. I personally prefer to play Assassin's Creed Unity in French because, in my opinion, if I'm playing a game that's set in France during one of the most important French historical eras, I want to be playing it with French audio. And I think that games just have this unique ability to really put you in the shoes of people from that era, from that time period, from that culture. I really do think that the more history that we see represented in video games, the more people look at them and go, okay, well, if this happened if I'm playing this game and this game is representing this accurately, then I can kind of get an idea as to what it would have been like to actually be like participating in this culture. And I think that's kind of where like it's a beautiful part of video games, and it's also kind of representative of media overall, where media overall can have that effect, but if it's done wrong, then it can lead to the reinforcement of negative stereotypes. It can lead to absolutely kind of like horrendous imagery that will persist hundreds of years afterwards. You see this a lot
Right.
with like early animated films. Like black people are portrayed as almost animalistic in some sense, and ways that, like even today, we can take a lot of like a racist opinions that are prevalent today and kind of trace them back to back then, or media when pushing those beliefs.
Right.
And I think that,
Well,
oh, sorry.
to touch on something you said that I think is very important and that is very powerful about games is that we've been talking about this lingua franca, right? About English as a sort of a filter that everything has to be filtered through to be globally accessible, to have any success in the games industry. But it's really easy to forget that playfulness is a language, right? It's probably one of the oldest human languages that we have is the sense of like playing.
Oh,
Of
absolutely. 100%.
when we were first sort of like getting our bearings, people that were more playful, that would throw a rock at a tree just because they could, right, would get better at aiming and would have a higher chance at, hunting down something. People that climbed in a tree for fun had a higher chance of surviving any, collision with a predator. Playfulness sort of evolved into us, and it is probably the most global language in the world. You put a soccer ball on the ground anywhere in the world and you kick it towards somebody, they might not be good at it, but people will kick the ball back, or will at least try to kick the ball back, right? If you throw a ball at somebody, they will try and catch it. If you put a board in front of somebody, they will understand that you want to play. So games have, as an evolution of play, or as a subdivision of play, video games have tremendous opportunity at bridging language, bridging culture, bridging anything. Because if we can believe that we are part of a culture that worships a crystal in a castle that summons dragons and we need to defend this, then surely we can do the same for anything else, right?
Right.
If we can play across language barriers and play a game of FIFA or NBA or whatever it is, and have a good time despite not being able to speak a word to each other, then that emphasizes just how powerful play is. So to see play used in this cynical propagandist way that, based on the interviews that I've read and based on the things that Tamte has been saying, is extremely disappointing. Because there's so much potential there, and there's so much potential in a game like 6 Days in Fallujah to step over so many of the issues we've talked about, right? To step over having to filter it through a US filter per se, to step over the lingua franca, to step over not being able to know the history of a country and the history of a place. This game, if done properly, could be so important to the history of the medium, to the future of the medium, as a game that showcased in many ways that games can tackle topics like this in a very genuine, very sincere, very powerful way. And the honest truth is that if they manage to do that, the game would not be fun. Because war isn't fun, right? It just isn't. It's
Right.
horrifying. It's traumatic. It's you lose people, you lose friends, you lose your house, you lose your life, you lose your family. I think recent numbers from Afghanistan said that over 97% of Afghani people have been directly affected by the war in some way. That's a national thing, right? Like that is enormous. I don't know the latest number for Iraq, but they are also not low, right? So if you want to talk about this in a game, you should make a game that isn't fun. You should make a game that ends up closer to this war of mine. And the fact that you read an interview with Tamten and it says something like, well, nobody wants to play the Iraqi perspective. I don't think that's interesting. Well, that tells you everything you need to know about the project. Yes, it's a documentary. Absolutely. They're interviewing people, but they're making very specific selections about which stories get told, which perspectives they were hunting for and looking for, where they asked. And if, Tamte says in an interview that he doesn't want to tackle white phosphorus because he hasn't heard any direct stories about that. I've been talking to people that lived in Fallujah, obviously, after the story broke, because people reached out to me. People don't trust the U.S. press overwhelmingly, especially in the Middle East.
Given everything the U.S. press has done.
The irony of 6 Days in Fallujah is when they went for interviews, a lot of people didn't want to talk to them because they thought they were CIA informants. And the irony is that at that time, the original project was actually partially CIA funded. So they weren't wrong.
Yeah.
But a lot of people just don't want to talk. They're afraid of what happens when they speak to U.S. press. They're afraid of what happens to their chance at opportunity, at their chance of being in the games industry, right? Because it's such a U.S.-focused industry. And if you can get your visa rejected for a WhatsApp image that a friend sends to you, then you can surely get it rejected for speaking out against the U.S. military. Freedom of speech is a U.S. constitutional right. The U.S. Constitution only applies to U.S. citizens. So, I don't get to say what I want. I don't have a right to. I don't have a constitutional right to either. The idea that the U.S. Constitution is for everybody is so widespread that you will hear people in the Netherlands or Britain refer to freedom of speech before somebody reminds them that actually doesn't exist here the way it does in the U.S. But we've watched enough, news and movies in which it's referred to that we just kind of believe it's here too. We have a different type of protection of speech, but we don't have freedom of speech. If we say something offensive or something that will damage other people, then there's laws. That doesn't extend to Middle Eastern folks. Definitely doesn't extend to Middle Eastern folks. So people didn't want to talk. They did talk to me, a lot of them, and some of the people that were in the city are like, those stories were so widespread that I don't know who they talked to if they didn't hear about this, but it must have been a very good selection of people if they managed to dodge that topic entirely.
Right. And that's honestly my biggest issue with the documentary style approach that they're taking is that, like I said, a documentary should be able to kind of like turn your heel like super quickly about the topic. Like the topic of your documentary can change like drastically from when you first started out. And I feel that like the documentary approach that they're taking with 6 Days in Fallujah is more so about taking what they already have and just kind of like going, okay, like we have the U.S. soldiers and we have the 10% of Iraqi stories that we have, but they already had like the perspective going into it. They might not either they might have not have been able to, or they had no interest in switching gears to more accurately portray the atrocities and war crimes that went on in Fallujah. I feel like games are a little bit less like malleable than filmmaking in regards to that. Filmmaking is very linear in how it's edited. There's not a lot of programming involved. And I feel like with games, it might be a little bit like a more of a, it might be different. I don't know much about the game development cycle at all, so that's something I'm not really too sure about.
I mean, with games, you always have the additional question mark of the player. You always have the additional question mark of interactivity and players not necessarily doing what you want. So there's absolutely additional complexity. But again, the Dragon Cancer has shown that you can absolutely make a game set in very difficult topics that is autobiographical or biographical, that is true, that is documentary-esque in how it's set up. But like with movie documentaries, right? You can make a documentary about a thing, right? And try to tell its story. Or you can make a documentary with a purpose where you already know the story you want to tell. And Six Days in Fallujah is the latter. And that doesn't disqualify it as a documentary. It just makes it a game I very desperately do not need, do not want, and do think will do damage to people's understanding of a very complicated, well, not even that complicated, a very awful, a very atrocious history that is still alive, that is still ongoing, that hasn't ended. The war isn't over. The people didn't stop hurting. And now the country that brought that war, the country that invaded their lands, the country that destroyed their city, that killed their children, their fathers, their mothers, now that country is making a game to make money, to tell people how sad their soldiers are. And if that isn't the most abysmal thing I've heard in a very long time, I don't know what is, because it's infuriating. It's almost impossible to explain in words just how disrespectful making the country that brought a war, making a game to profit from that war, where they only tell one side of the story of that war in support of that war. Like every sentence you add, it gets worse.
Right.
And part of me still hopes I'll be wrong, but if Peter Tamte is the leader of the project, right? He's the creative director of that project. And if the way he speaks about it, the level of regard he has for the lack of regard he has for the Iraqi people, and the ease at which he describes the game as a horror, but only for the U.S. soldiers, the U.S. military, without any mention of the Iraqi civilians, then there's just very little hope left for me.
I agree completely. And unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. But I wanted to thank you so much for this. Has been an absolutely incredible interview. And before we end, I just wanted to ask if you had anything you wanted to shout out, any upcoming projects or involvements. I know you have the Habibis podcast, which I recommend everyone go listen to. But is there anything else that you would like to shout out?
If people want to follow me and what I do, easiest way to keep in touch is Twitter, THA_Rami, Rami being RAM for Mary, and then I. The Habibis would obviously be a very good place to follow me. It's a podcast about video games and Arab culture, where we talk about 3 Arab game developers drink good Arab tea, talking about weird Arab things. It's been very nice for me, like for many of the topics we talked about today, just being able to talk with fellow Arabs and not have to explain our jokes and our stories through another filter. If you want to know what 3 Arab game developers talking sounds like, then that's a good place to go. You can follow that at thehabibis.com. Beyond that, I shut down my game studio Vlambeer in September of last year. If you still want to play some fun video games, arcade video games, check out vlambeer.com. Beyond that, new adventures await. I've had a good year to sort of reinvent myself to see what's up next. If you follow my Twitter, that'll be the best place to figure out what's next.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Have a great day and please stay safe.